is a story about the names of God. A renowned holy man was invited to speak in a seminar at a spiritual academy. He came in after the program had already begun and sat quietly at the back. The principal, a well-educated man in academic robes, seemed to look disapprovingly at the sage, who was wearing clean but rough garments. He was speaking about the spiritual path and how, as someone gradually learned all the names of God, he or she would progress along the path. And Allah, Ahura Mazda, Yazdan, Izad, he said, impressing everyone with his spiritual knowledge. And, of course, Brahma, Yahweh. When it was the holy man's turn to speak, the principal said, Perhaps your holiness can give us more of the names of God, since you are renowned as a saint. Let's have tea first, said the sage. The principal grumbled, but tea was ordered and brought into the room by a servant, an old woman who struggled with the tray and the cups. The principal spoke sharply to her as she slopped tea out of a cup. When she got to the sage, he spoke quietly to her. Smiling, she left the room. When she was finished, the holy man stood up and said, You are all hoping to learn the many names of God. Am I correct? Yes, said the principal. God has many names, and as an aspirant progresses, he gradually learns them all. Tell me, said the holy man, what is the name of the old serving woman who was just here? How should I know? Asked the startled principal. I am the head of the academy, and she is just a servant. The holy man smiled and asked the assembled students the same question. They returned blank stares, except for one young woman at the back of the hall. Excuse me, sir, she said. I believe her name is Anna. You're right, said the holy man. Turning to the principal, he said, You see, God has more names than you think.
Hello, everyone out there. Some of you know me pretty well by now. And for those who don't, I want to just tell you that I'm a guy who likes to keep things cheerful. I hate being sad. I've never understood why people in Ireland will drive hundreds of miles to listen to people singing songs that make them cry. I never go to sad movies. I don't read sad books. I still shudder at the thought of old Shep. But never mind. There's sometimes when things happen which are sad. And in a winter in which 3 beloved members of our congregation have died, I'd be letting everybody down, myself included, if I didn't say a few things about this mystery we call death. And you know, I think I should call their names as well. Reverend Steve Dick, Henry Walsh, John Krask. I notice that when death hits a person with whom you are close, a sense of what I would have to call identity confusion appears. Suddenly that thing that makes us all say, not me, not yet, is now. And yes, it could be me. And those times the most hardened of atheists seem to soften up just a bit. The closely guarded ideas we have of a universe without particular meaning are invaded by questions, the kinds of questions that a child might ask. The end of life has probably been the single most endemic preoccupation with us since the cave days. If you ask a person in the street about religion, they're very likely to say something like, "I don't believe in life after death." This proves that the driving force in Christianity has always been in that comic phrase, how to beat the reaper. That's why the loss and belief of the literal bodily resurrection of Jesus, the resurrection, has accompanied the largest drop in membership in history. Because if you can't beat death with religion, what good is it? So the point at which we cease to exist now seems to hover on the horizon even more alarmingly than it did before. We've had to find other ways to deal with it. Well, one way to do this is the simplest. Don't look at it. We have several methods of accomplishing this form of denial. One is to keep yourself distracted so that your eyes don't often scan the horizon. You can do this with overwork or with obsessional activities like hobbies and things like living for the children. Or you can take refuge in one of many addictions such as booze or overwork or shopping or sex. One way to ignore death is to collude with society in pretending it doesn't exist. We've hidden death in a way never before possible in private hospital rooms, in euphemisms, in fantasies of marvelous doctors who will cure just about everything someday, in the guilty dumping of coins in Cancer Society tin cups on the street. When I went to work in rural Africa, where death is your next door neighbor, I realized that the most innocent child knew more about death than we do. I've seen kids of 6 laying out and washing their own mothers and carrying stones to cover the grave against wild animals. Most of us do not even see our dead relatives in their coffins, let alone cover their eyes. We let someone else do that, someone out of sight. When our hearts are torn out by loss, we call a psychotherapist who will soothe us and describe what is happening to us in scientific terms. We'll learn that it's something called bereavement, that it has 5 stages, and thus named some of the sting is removed from it. And though we might feel better, we still have managed to avoid looking at the issue itself directly. When denial breaks down, we may turn to prevention. We get out the statins and the B vitamins. We buy a pair of Reeboks and we jog around the park. Avoiding coronavirus becomes a constant routine, if not an obsession. We avidly read magazines that offer diets to keep our arteries clear and secretly believe in magical remedies. We want the enemy named clearly: cholesterol, smoking, red meat, and when we hear about new breakthroughs in genetic medicine, we exult. Once again, that background refrain. Not me, not yet. But we can hear the whispers in the background, saying those oldest and most terrifying words there are. Yes, you too. If we're strong enough, honest enough, we hear this before the biopsy results are back or the 18-wheeler hurdles the center barrier on the highway. Thinkers like Carl Jung have pointed out that when the sun crosses the zenith at midlife, that the question of one's end should move more to the center of one's life. The last few decades are for spending in making oneself ready. Teachers have said things like, living fully is learning to die. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was really known as the Book of Living and Dying, and it undertakes to do just that, teach you how to die. A mature religious faith is one that helps you move beyond the stages of denial and useless hopes of prevention into a full acceptance of this most crucial of human appointments. You know, if all this sounds morbid, and perhaps it does, I still hear myself say, you know, if it does sound morbid, that probably means we've still got some work to do. And it means that we need to prepare the way for death the same way we do for birth. That we need to use a perspective gleaned from the awareness of the inevitable and use it to create more depth in our lives. I was once asked a question by a church member near the end of her life, that most basic of questions. She said, "Do you believe in life after death?" And does it seem strange that she might ask someone who was a minister of religion that question? But we are Unitarians, and you can well imagine the surprise I felt. But without thinking, sort of automatically, here's what I told her. I believe that who we really are has always existed. Before our birth, during our lifespan, and after we die. I think the reason we don't realize it while we live is because we're too busy with the details of being just our limited selves to feel like somebody older than time itself, which is what we really are. I think that that's the reason for prayer and meditation and poetry. It puts us just that little bit in touch with our real selves. I think it's the only valid reason, actually, for what's called ethics and morality. Doing harm to others is doing harm to oneself. I think people like Jesus and the Buddha remind us of our true selves, our true natures. And that's why we deify them. And I think that what we call love, well, that's a visible sign of that invisible reality, because loving is feeling the underlying oneness of everything. Well, I'm not describing some kind of state that's like a vague pink cloud in which the individuality of the departed person gets lost. What I believe, and I can quote from virtually all the great spiritual traditions of history for support, is that when you leave off being the person that you've managed to convince yourself that you are, you once again become the person who you really are. As a very young child, you haven't yet accepted your spell of limitation in a single body, a single family, a single chunk of time. That's why the border between reality and fantasy is so permeable in kids. As you age, you become used to the idea of your limited existence. But sometimes, just for a moment, something like a memory, maybe a brief glimpse of a mountain sunset, or a sense of being overwhelmed by starry skies, returns you for an instant to this feeling of being yourself, but being yourself in a different way, unworried, unattached, and loving. We rely on the great mystics and poets and artists to jog our memories in this. And at its best, that's what a moment in a place like our church or a shared half hour online might have to offer. Not every week, not every Sunday, bloody Sunday, but sometimes. And to be honest, that's why I'm in this job in the first place. If we really already are a self that's real, but just not visible quite from here, then the matter of fearing death changes. And I've often said, yeah, I fear death, but only in the way that I fear the dentist or jumping into cold water. I don't fear non-existence because I know, and I want you please to pardon me this little firm assertion, I know that there's no such thing. When it's time to pack up and go, it may well seem a wrench. But packing up and going always does, as you leave behind what has been your life and head out onto a new road. And yes, it may be true that you can't accompany your loved ones down this new road. But the pain that remains behind, the pain that we carry, is not really for them. To my way of thinking, their existence is secure, even as our own is. As the Sufi saying goes, the knot may be unraveled, but the rope remains. It's natural to grieve for the knot, but we need not fear for the rope. We may honestly feel sympathy for the bereaved, but for the dead, the right response, if only we could manage it, would be a cheery bon voyage. Well, I worried for days about delivering this particular sermon. And that's because just for a moment I seem to be leaving behind our bland custom of celebrating the questions. It seemed time to say, particularly in the face of what our small congregation has recently been through, to say as plainly as possible what I believe. And you're free, no, you're welcome to dismiss it as wishful thinking. But maybe it might sound, I don't know, somehow familiar. In any event, there's only one way to find out, and we will, which makes me want to say, Amen.